In August of 1966, the Beatles released their album Revolver, and with it arguably came one of their strangest, most somber, and even haunting songs, Eleanor Rigby. Also released as a single alongside Yellow Submarine, it tells the story of a woman who lives a rather lonely and unremarkable life, desperately looking for something that she ultimately never gets: sincere human connection. She dies and, as the song puts it, is buried along with her name, leaving the entire story of a unique human life forever lost to time. She is buried by Father Mackenzie, who is another lonely man simply performing his sacred duty as a priest to bury her, with the song implying that he too will meet a very similar fate. It is a deep, nihilistic reflection on the people in our lives who serve mostly as extras or just background noise, many of whom never get the chance to leave the imprint that they want. Unlike anything else the Beatles have put out at that time, it was dashingly salient and out of place from their mostly traditional rock and roll teen bop songs, leaving an everlasting message with its melancholic violin orchestra. All the lonely people, where do they all belong? Now, when Paul McCartney wrote the song, he used characters that were completely made up to provide a veil of anonymity that protects those concerned and only empowers the song's theme of seclusion and futility. Paul got the name Father Mackenzie from the phone book, as he originally wrote it as Father McCartney, but thought it was too closely related to him. He got the name Eleanor from Eleanor Braun, who starred in the Beatles' most recent film, Help. While looking for a surname, he stumbled upon a wine shop in Bristol named Rigby and Evans. And so, Eleanor Rigby was created. But as it turns out, the story doesn't stop there. In fact, it gets much weirder, and has since become the subject of a several-decade-old mystery. Just outside St. Peter's Church in Woolton, Liverpool, the very church where Paul and John met for the very first time, lies a cemetery. Of the many interments here is none other than a mysterious woman named Eleanor Rigby. And right nearby, a Father Mackenzie. It is by cosmic, almost divine coincidence that the exact names which Paul found on a store sign and in a phone book had previously been long engraved at the very place where he and John made history. Was Eleanor Rigby simply just an idea conjured up on the spot by Paul McCartney to embody a life of emptiness and isolation? Or is there more to the story of Eleanor Rigby that we don't know about? Pretty much no information is publicly available about Eleanor Rigby interred at St. Peter's Church. We know nothing about her backstory, the lives she led, or the people she left behind to carry on her memory. For the public, Eleanor Rigby is a complete ghost to time, a fate tragically fitting for the song that she unintentionally personifies. But what is the little information that we do know about her? Is there more to Eleanor Rigby's life that can easily be resurfaced but just hasn't? And can any of it provide more insight or even closure behind the making of one of the most iconic songs in modern pop culture? You might notice that the background is a little bit different from my typical videos, and that is because right now I'm staying at a very special place, the Casbah Coffee Club in Liverpool. It is the rock and roll venue where the Beatles regularly performed and even slept in the late 50s and early 60s before they reached worldwide stardom. Right now, I am in the McCartney Suite, in the exact spot where this early Beatles photo was taken. It feels very special, almost spiritual, getting to be in a place like this that is just full of so much beautiful history. I figured filming this video in that very spot would be a good way to honor that history and to contribute a part of my life to it as well, in a much more permanent way. It is also not at all far from here, where the grave of Eleanor Rigby is located. In fact, it is right nearby Strawberry Fields, which of course will be its own separate video. And this grave's location could actually be our very first clue behind figuring out this strange mystery. It has been theorized by many Beatles fans that the creation of Eleanor Rigby, the character, was none other than a byproduct of the subconscious memory of Paul McCartney. You'll start to notice that this kind of thing shows up as a bit of a pattern just with Beatles work in general. For Eleanor Rigby, this would especially make sense, given the kind of history that St. Peter's Church has with the band. Yes, this was the place where Paul met John for the very first time and performed for him to join the Quarrymen, but it also became a bit of a social spot that the two would frequent, typically smoking and drinking together behind all these tombstones. Sounds like a bit of a strange place for some teenagers to hang out, but John and Paul were strange guys. John even humorously called it the Bone Orchard. But this hangout spot was also a bit practical. These cemeteries were often very empty, and the monuments and statues were tall enough to obstruct them from the few people who were around. It was the perfect place for some young hooligans to fool around. And so, St. Peter's Church was often the place to be for a young John and Paul. Because of this, it is highly possible that Paul may have seen and walked by this Eleanor Rigby grave quite a few times, and then subconsciously registered it in his head. This may have been why the Rigby and Evans name stood out to him so prominently when trying to find a surname for Eleanor. It is really not that far-fetched of an idea when you think about the other ways that Beatles songwriting potentially parallel this, such as with George Harrison's My Sweet Lord. This song was famously involved in a lawsuit due to its strikingly similar melody to He's So Fine by the Chiffons, which was released 7 years prior. A judge ruled that this was the result of subconscious plagiarism, which resulted in George having to pay significant royalties to the group. This meant that George likely heard the song playing somewhere back in the early 60s, and that melody just stuck with him, only to resurface years later in a form that he initially could not recognize, and so he wrote My Sweet Lord. The same situation could have very well happened with Eleanor Rigby. I believe that this is the most likely possibility, but the other one is that this could very well just be a huge coincidence. Eleanor Rigby does sound like an oddly specific and niche name, but it was actually more common than you'd think, especially at that time. If you look at wedding announcements and obituaries in England from the time, there are a bunch of Eleanor Rigbys. Heck, there's even quite a few of them in Liverpool. You can even find other graves in the city that have the name Eleanor Rigby on them. Now, was it John Smith? No. But it was not exactly a completely unheard of name either, making the odds of it appearing on a tombstone nearby where John and Paul hung out not as astronomical. In fact, this would just add to the possibility that Paul casually saw this name on this tombstone many times as a kid and didn't think much of it. She was buried before any of the Beatles were even born, after all, so the timeline would add up. Then, when Paul was writing the song years later, that name subconsciously unlocked what was still a very faint, distant memory once he saw that Rigby and Evans store sign. As for Father Mackenzie on this grave died long before Eleanor Rigby did, and from what I could gather, they are not a Catholic priest, so I could put that as just a coincidence. If this is indeed what happened, this would make the Eleanor Rigby that is buried at St. Peter's Church over in Woolton the Eleanor Rigby. Not just one of many in the English census, but the one that is the unintended subject of the famed Beatles song. Which in that case, what is her story? Eleanor Rigby's life remained, for many years, a complete mystery, with nothing attesting to her existence beyond her epitaph. But thanks to the power and love of Beatles music and incredible documentation and preservation efforts from the internet, we are now starting to learn just a little bit more. In 2008, a music teacher who worked with the Sunbeam Trust charity, came forward with a very interesting story. In 1989, she reached out to Paul McCartney in hopes of him making a donation to the charity. Instead of sending money, he sent back a very old-looking, folded piece of paper. It was a payroll ledger from the Liverpool City Hospital dated 1911. The signature on the page was from Eleanor Rigby. This was at least the story that was told by Annie Mawson, the recipient of the slip, and she was absolutely astonished. Not only did it seem totally out of nowhere, but it may just finally put many years of speculation to rest. Was the Eleanor Rigby this 16-year-old scullery maid from Park Hill? The ages from the tombstone and the ledger do line up, and some people even noted that the lyrics to the song somewhat fit with this profession, with her picking up rice in a church after a wedding. Paul was asked about this whole situation not too long after, and his response was even more interesting. He explicitly denied that this song was about this specific woman who worked as a maid, and that it once again was a completely made-up person. But if Paul is indeed adamant about this, then why would he voluntarily send this ledger out? To a random charity of all places. My guess is that it could have been his way of donating to the cause by giving them something historically very valuable, which could then be auctioned off with the proceeds going to that charity. Paul's own spokesperson gave a response that was even stranger and much more open-ended. She simply said that she could not confirm that Paul himself was the one who sent it out. This is very odd to me, given that since she is Paul's spokesperson, she could just ask him, right? Maybe I don't fully understand how all that works. Correct me if I'm wrong in the comments. But aside from this brown envelope stamped Paul McCartney World Tour that was sent to Annie Mawson, we have no other lead that this was in fact Paul who sent it. Either way, the world finally received, under mysterious circumstances, the first confirmed documentation of Eleanor Rigby's identity since her grave was first culturally discovered in 1984. The ledger was then auctioned off for £115,000. This groundbreaking discovery, along with the names and dates on the tombstone, gave people a lot more information to keep digging even further on Eleanor Rigby. The website BeatlesLiverpoolandMore.com did an amazing consolidation of all the details we currently know about Eleanor Rigby. The top name on this tombstone is John Rigby, her grandfather. He, along with his wife and children, can be found in the 1891 Woolton census. And sure enough, the names of his children do check out with what is mentioned on the grave. They are listed as residing at an address that appears to no longer exist. These documents may also provide a lot of insight into why it took so long for any information on Eleanor Rigby to publicly surface. Eleanor technically had a different last name. She was the daughter of Arthur Whitfield and Mary Elizabeth Rigby. But her father died just a few weeks after she was born. Because she never truly knew him and was fully taken care of by her mother and her grandfather John, she naturally started going by just Eleanor Rigby. This discrepancy was likely a big hurdle for researchers trying to find birth records on her, since they were technically using the incorrect surname of Rigby instead of Whitfield, as there was really no way they could have known about the latter. Throughout her teenage years, Eleanor would start switching back and forth between these surnames, with the 1911 census listing her as Eleanor Whitfield, and evidently with her payroll ledger from that same year saying only Rigby. As mentioned earlier, she was working as a hospital scullery maid at this time. She would then marry in 1930 at the age of 35 to railway worker Thomas Woods, whose name is also mentioned on this tombstone. The two never had any children, and at the age of 44, she died asleep, as her grave puts it, on October 10th, 1939. And that is everything we currently know about Eleanor Rigby. Though there are some things mentioned that, based on my research, seem a bit like conjecture, as I couldn't find any proof or primary sources to back the claims up. For example, Some sites claim that she and Thomas were unable to have children, which is why she does not have any living descendants. Some websites also claim that she died of a brain hemorrhage, but once again, I could not find anything definitive on this, as her grave simply says, asleep. Whether this means she died in her sleep or if the tombstone was using this metaphorically to refer to her resting place, I have no idea. The remaining aspects of her life get very foggy. There aren't even any surviving photographs of her that are public, so we have no idea what she even looked like. This fact is really hammered in by Tommy Steele's Eleanor Rigby statue, erected just a couple blocks away from the Cavern Club, which has an intentionally faded out and obscured face. It also really beautifully symbolizes the song's theme of isolation and the second death we experience with the passage of time. First, when your physical body ceases to breathe, and second, when you are forgotten. It's even more interesting to me that two of Eleanor Rigby's half-sisters, Edith and Hannah, lived all the way up to the year 2001, both dying that same year. From what I could gather, these would have been the very last people who actually saw and knew Eleanor Rigby personally. The last ones who had any true memory of her. Considering how recent this was, this makes me wonder if they ever knew about their half-sister's grave getting all this public attention. They most certainly knew about the Beatles song at the very least. The fact that neither one of them ever came forward with an interview or any kind of information or photographs of her shows that they either didn't know about it or, for whatever reason, just chose not to say anything. It's possible that they just wanted to keep the remaining private parts of her life story strictly a family matter, which I completely understand. In that case, maybe it's better that the full story of Eleanor Rigby remains unclear and ambiguous, as this was a woman who, as far as she knew, lived a full yet exceptionally ordinary life. She had absolutely no idea that she was going to be the center of attention in a huge aspect of rock and roll culture. She was a real person who laughed, cried, and had people around her who loved her and carried on her memory until they no longer could. Perhaps that first-hand, sacred memory of her should stay with her family, and those within it who are still surviving. We may never know if this is the true Eleanor Rigby, but either way, she serves to represent those who unfortunately lived lives in isolation and didn't get to make the kind of lasting impact that they wanted, and hence being buried along with their name. But through Eleanor Rigby, both the song and the woman buried at St. Peter's Church in Woolton, Liverpool, they can finally be loved, remembered, and immortalized as the very real and unique people they once were. At least for now, maybe that's where they all belong. If you would like to see more Beatles-related content, please subscribe and like this video and let me know your thoughts in the comments below. You can also check out my main channel here, where I talk about technology, internet nostalgia, and online culture. Thank you for watching, everyone.